All right, welcome back to Pod Logic Outside, episode 2. As you can see, I'm outside. I've upgraded my studio, my outdoor studio a little bit. Got a nice plant here, a desk, and I brought my real microphone out here because I hated holding it last week and got some feedback and said it looked weird. So now you have got the full outdoor studio vision of what it's going to look like. And if you're listening on podcast, feel free to jump over to YouTube if you like. If not, you're not going to hurt my feelings. But today we're going to be talking about defining the goal and topic for your podcast. Now, this is extremely important because if you go into starting your podcast with just, I want to start a podcast, I don't care what it's about, you are going to fail. And I think you knew that already, but we'll get into a little bit more of the detail as we touch on these two aspects of podcasting. So let's talk about the topic first. So when you pick your topic for what your podcast is going to be about, you want to niche down. Don't be too broad. No one wants to listen to the podcast where the title or the tag of your podcast is, we talk about anything and everything under the sun, whatever we feel like talking about. No one wants to hear that because you don't have an audience built up. If you were a famous person that was starting a podcast and you said, I'm just going to talk about whatever's on, what's his name? What's the guy who plays Andy on The Office? Ed Helms. I'm just going to talk about whatever's on Ed Helms' mind. People would listen to that because people know who Ed Helms is. They don't know who you are and they don't know who I am. So it's not going to be about anything and everything. So niche down. It's similar to that Facebook group commercial with all the people playing the kazoos. There are people out there that want to know about kazoos. So if you want to start a kazoos podcast, make it about kazoos. Don't make it about everything that you think is going to be interesting to talk about. So niche down. There is literally a community for everything you could possibly be interested in. Why wouldn't your podcast fall under the same category? The second thing that's most important is you want to pick something that you're an expert in or something that you're passionate about. If you are going to talk about something on your podcast that you don't really care about, what's going to be the motivation that brings you back to the microphone every single week? That doesn't make any sense. You want to pick something that, A, you know what you're talking about on, because people are going to be tuning in to you to learn about something. So if you're the expert in that topic, you have a much better chance at growing that podcast and actually growing an audience because you're providing something new, you're providing something informative. And if you can make it slightly entertaining at the same time, you're in a really good spot. So picking something that you're an expert in, something you're passionate about, something that's going to make you want to put out a podcast every single week or month or however often you're going to be putting out new episodes. And then from there, you want to create what is called the podcast idea bank. And if you go back and listen to a sit-down episode I had with Catherine O'Brien on the podcast, she brings up an idea from a guy named Daniel J. Lewis called the podcast idea bank. So what you want to do is you want to pull out a Google Doc, pull out your legal pad, start writing out some notes, minimum of 25 people, questions, or topics related to your podcast that could be its own episode. If you can list out 25 ideas, topics, or people that you want to interview, if you're putting out a weekly content, that's like 6 months worth of episodes right there. And you just start hacking away, putting out episodes based on those topics. So putting together that idea bank is really going to start to formulate what your podcast is going to be about. So I highly encourage you to do the podcast idea bank. And number 4 is define your audience. Who is the person that you're targeting that you want to listen to your podcast? Try to define that person who's going to be tuning in, gear your content towards them. So that's how you're going to kind of narrow down what your topic is going to be about. Now let's talk about what the goal of the podcast should be. So in my professional opinion, you need to have one clearly defined answer to this question. What is the reason I'm starting this podcast? Oops, it's getting a little windy. It's getting a little windy here. All right. What is the reason I'm starting this podcast? And before you say your answer, if the answer is money or to get sponsorships, find a new goal or don't start the podcast, because I have a rude awakening for you, my friend. This is mostly a hobbyist thing, or it's going to be a complement to your business that's already bringing in dollars into the bank account. So if the answer is going to be money, you need to take into consideration the fact that this thing is going to take 1 to 3 years to build up your audience, especially if you're someone like you or me watching this video that has zero audience to start with. You have to build that audience brick by brick by brick, person by person, listener by listener, subscriber by subscriber, in order to hit a point where you have amassed an audience that's returning every single week that will warrant companies to want to sponsor your podcast. Or you can reach out to people and say, hey, look, I've amassed this audience of 10,000 people that are listening an episode, or 5,000 people, or 1,000 people, or 500 people that are really dedicated listeners listening to this audience. Do you want to sponsor my podcast? So just take that into consideration. Take it with a grain of salt. It is really difficult, especially now with there being over 1 million podcasts out there on Apple Podcasts alone. It is really tough to start from zero and legitimately build up a podcast to a point to where that is going to be your sole form of income. It can complement your other incomes if you get it to a point to where you're getting sponsorships, but it's just something that you really need to seriously consider. I'm sorry to burst anybody's bubble, but that's just the reality of the situation we're in these days. Number 3 for goals. There are several different goals you could potentially have for your podcast. So, is your goal to inform people? It could be to build awareness around your brand or your company. It could be to talk to really interesting people. It could be to get in front of folks that you want to turn into clients or potentially work for. And that's something that I really hit on a lot is if you are someone that wants to, say you're a salesperson and you sell something X and you want to bring in this client, but you know that you're not going to get your foot into the door. If you have an interview podcast that's talking about what their industry focuses on, they are much more likely to sit down and have a conversation with you. Take the selling portion out of it. You are much more likely to make that person a client or even just build that personal relationship with them if they come on your podcast and if you have a podcast. So it's a great tool for networking, building up potential clients, people that you potentially want to work for. There's a ton of different reasons that you could start this podcast. And I find those to be the most successful beyond wanting to build up an audience. So there you have it. That's defining your goals and topics for your podcast. If you find this interesting and you enjoyed the video, I would hope that you subscribe. If you're listening to this, please subscribe to the podcast. If you're watching, go check out the podcast. And if you're listening, go check out the video. So kind of a vice versa type of deal. And if you want to learn more about what we're doing over at Straight Up Podcast, you can check out our website at straightuppodcast.com. We produce podcasts for executives, businesses, and universities at a very high level. And I'm very proud of what we've been able to do over at Straight Up. So please check it out. We're doing a lot of cool things. Stay safe, and I'll see you next week.